más guapo con más dinero. Como te quiero yo, no lo busques que no he ido. Y te lo juro por mi madre, que tengo que conseguir que me cabe de más también.
Hello everybody, welcome to a new episode of Lateral Conversations. My name is Thomas Mark. Today I have a very special treat for you. My guest is Dr. Rick Strassman. Rick is the leading expert in DMT research. He's also a book author. He wrote DMT, the Spirit Molecule, and DMT, the Soul of Prohecy, a book in which he correlates the DMT experience with a special type of spiritual experience, the state of prophecy from the Hebrew Bible, to be more specific. So we are talking a lot about his insights, about his model, about his research, about the spiritual and evolutionary purpose of the DMT experience. I hope you will enjoy this conversation as much as I did. Before we come to that, I would like to thank everybody who supported this podcast with the Amazon affiliate link at the site. Somebody I know who bought a Dyson vacuum cleaner for nearly $200. Thank you very much for this. Another way to support this podcast is the Patreon link, where you can pledge some money. I'm always very grateful for this. You can find, last but not least, this podcast now also at iTunes. So just look for Lateral Conversations and you will find all the episodes there. So, without further ado, this is my conversation with Rick Strassman. I hope you will enjoy it. I wish you all the best, and I hope we hear each other next week. Rick, thank you for joining me in my podcast. From where are you calling?
Well, I'm in Gallup, New Mexico, near the Arizona border.
New Mexico.
The western part of the state.
Okay. Isn't that where this Santa Fe? Is that where?
Well, Santa Fe is in New Mexico. It's about a 3-hour drive from here,
Okay.
3.25.
Okay. A quick word to you and your work. You're a medical doctor, and you were the one who led a government-approved research project about DMT, which led to your book, DMT and the Spirit Molecule. And then you released last year a follow-up to that book, DMT and the Soul of Prohecy. So just for German listeners, what is DMT and why do you call it the spirit molecule?
Well, so DMT stands for dimethyltryptamine. It's a relatively simple compound, not much larger than a sugar molecule. It's a very powerful psychedelic drug, which is found in hundreds, if not thousands, of plants, and also was discovered in human body fluids and tissues in the 1960s. And I was led to looking at DMT because I was interested in determining the biological bases of spiritual experience.
Okay.
Things which might occur from prayer, from fasting, from from meditation, from near-death experiences. I began looking at the pineal gland, which about which not much was known in the early 1980s. once I completed my research training. And I looked at melatonin, which is the primary pineal hormone, because there were some preliminary data suggesting it was, psychedelic. And because of the esoteric significance of the pineal, I thought if the pineal, if the pineal, product melatonin was, psychedelic, and it increased, for example, during spiritual experiences, then that would help explain the occurrence of such states. But we gave a lot of melatonin to people, and it wasn't especially, psychoactive. Primarily it was, sedating. So by that time, I'd learned about DMT, and it had been used in previous human studies and was quite psychedelic. And because of its being naturally produced in the human being, it seemed like a more suitable candidate for a naturally occurring compound which had spiritual properties. So I, as a result, worked on and got permission and funding from the U.S. government to look at DMT.
Wow.
The project was mostly it was solely intended as a psychopharmacology study, not necessarily to look at spiritual experience as such.
But your background was you were practicing Zen Buddhist, no? So that was your personal interest in the thing, to find an anatomical equivalent to the spiritual experience.
Right. And the spiritual, template or scaffolding or perspective that I had brought to bear on the spiritual, questions that I believed my study would raise, they were, as you mentioned, kind of steeped in the Zen Buddhist, tradition, which I'd been studying and, practicing for almost 20 years, by the time I began the study.
So that combined with your work as a medical doctor, you got approval to study this drug, which was discovered in the 1960s.
Well, so DMT was first, synthesized in a lab in the 1930s, but wasn't really, it was just one of a number of compounds in a series of tryptamine analogs. And after it was synthesized, it was just put on the shelf. But then maybe 10 years later, DMT was discovered in plants from Latin America that were being used for their psychoactive properties. Then pure DMT was discovered to be psychedelic in the 1950s. In Budapest. And maybe 10 years after that, it was discovered in the body fluids and tissues of mammals, including humans. So that began a number of studies that were attempting to relate the presence of DMT to mental illness. In particular psychosis and schizophrenia. Nobody was, looking at it as a, possible explanation for more, prized kinds of altered states of consciousness which occurred naturally, like mysticism or spiritual experience.
Yes. Yeah, I would suspect that from a biological viewpoint, that if you have a spiritual experience, that there must be an occurrence in the nervous system or in the body in some way.
Right. And, I started off with this, notion as an undergraduate, that there, must be some common underlying, biological, processes which occurred as a response to, taking psychedelics and in response to practicing particular kinds of meditation. To the extent, that the two, sets of experiences resembled each other. And if you look at descriptions of this psychedelic drug state and descriptions of the effects of certain kinds of meditation in Eastern religious, texts, there's quite a bit of overlap. And I was really struck by that, and that began me on my search.
So what exactly happens when you take DMT or got injected with DMT like you did in your research?
Yeah. Well, the first, research studies, focused on giving DMT intramuscularly. There were one or two studies giving it intravenously, but that seemed kind of dangerous. Or at least, there were some, side effects giving it intravenously. Once, DMT, kind of escaped the laboratory and was used recreationally, it was, vaporized in the freebase, form and inhaled. That's what's called smoking DMT, but, more accurately it's called, vaporizing DMT and, then inhaling the vapors. So in my study, I was being, funded by the National Institute on Drug Abuse, and therefore I needed, to replicate the abused way of using DMT, which was the smoked route. But smoking a, drug on a research unit was problematic, so I began with I began with one volunteer who had smoked DMT previously and gave him the drug intramuscularly in order for him to compare the quality and the time course of the experience. And he described the intramuscular way of giving it as slower, longer, and not as intense as the smoked route.
Oh, okay.
So we then decided to opt for the intravenous route, which was safe physically, and it more closely approximated the smoked route.
So DMT, and it's called a Class A drug, so normally it's prohibited, it's forbidden to use it by the law in the United States and most countries on our planet.
Yeah, it's placed in what's called the Schedule 1 in the U.S., which is reserved for substances which have got which cannot be used safely, even under medical supervision. Are highly abusable and have got known medical use. Those are the three criteria.
Okay. So again, what does happen when you give a client, a patient, or a test subject DMT, and how is the mind changing?
Yeah. When you give intravenous DMT, the effects begin within a couple of heartbeats. Actually, it's remarkably rapid in its onset. And the first thing that people notice is a feeling of inner pressure and acceleration, inner tension and acceleration, which then and also there's a sound which sometimes will accompany what the volunteers called the rush, like a high-pitched, crackling, or even kind of a, wah-wah kind of sound, which, became increasingly intense and louder, up, to the point of the, separation of the mind from the body, or at least, seemingly so. There are visual changes which occur early on, the first 15 to 30 seconds. If somebody keeps their eyes open, the room is overlaid with geometric, kaleidoscopic, rapidly moving, visual patterns.
Oh, okay.
And if you have your eyes closed, during the rush, the colors and the forms and the visions, the kaleidoscopic, geometric visions are even more intense. And within about a minute or so, maybe even less, with the higher doses of the drug, one feels as if the body is unable to contain the intensity of the experience, and there's a separation of consciousness from the body, and then one enters into a world of light, which is where all of the action takes place.
what I was asking myself, if these subjective realities you encounter with higher doses of DMT, what is their nature? Is it like a hallucination caused by in the form of intoxication, or is it something which tells you something about the architecture of the human mind, or does it tell you something about the true nature of our reality, or is it something beyond our normal understanding of what spirit and world is? How would you interpret these experiences, subjective realities?
Well, you're asking, I think, three different questions there.
Okay.
One of them is, the nature of, the DMT, world, or the DMT experience. The other is, the mechanisms of action. How does, this actually take place? And the third question is, what does it mean about human consciousness, our place in the cosmos, our relationships, to that. So I'm happy to begin with the most non-controversial, if one may call it that, which is just a simple phenomenological description of the state.
Okay.
Most of the volunteers would not describe it as an intoxication because their minds were quite clear. They weren't confused. They were able to observe quite precisely and carefully the nature of the experience, its contents, and they maintained their sense of self. They were able to interact with it willfully. They could ask of it questions. They could receive answers, to a certain extent. They retained a sense of individuality and control over themselves and their ability to interact, make decisions, those kinds of things. So they wouldn't describe themselves as being, stoned or intoxicated or out of it. They were quite clear, quite clear-headed, even though they, found themselves in a completely, novel environment. The state itself, seems to be extremely visual, made of light, as I mentioned earlier, and the light is more intensely, saturated. The colors more vivid, rapidly, moving, morphing, buzzing. Quality, to the light than anything encountered in everyday reality or even in dreams. And there also, seemed to be quite a bit of intelligence or information that was contained in that state. It was, somewhat auditory. There was a sound early on. Sometimes there was a spoken, voice. Mostly the exchange of information occurred, telepathically, rather than through, sounds themselves. The feelings were, all over the map, mostly. In the beginning, people, would be anxious just because of the speed of the transition. But, most people had a meditation, practice and were able to, calm themselves, during that, turbulent transition. Sometimes, people, describe it an ecstatic, euphoric, blissful state. A small number of people were terrified. And a significant number of, people were just, kind of calm, cool, and collected in that state. They weren't, necessarily panicked. They weren't, necessarily ecstatic. They were just kind of, they were kind of, passionately looking at what they had, discovered or been, presented with. So there were, feelings, perceptions. There wasn't much of a body, sensation. People could interact with this state. And, cognitively, they were, clear-headed. So the most striking qualities of the state were, visual nature, and the feeling of an intelligence that was either lurking behind the visions, or else would actually take some form in definitely discernible beings or entities, or some kind of objects, which the volunteer could recognize and then begin interacting with.
Interesting. So all in all, there were aspects which led to your original thesis that these states resembled states of enlightenment, descriptions what people experience when they have a near-death experience. But as far as I understand, you developed a more differentiated thesis that these states resemble more a prophetic state, and not an empty state of consciousness, but in a way there is something, there is a form, there's maybe an intelligence, and in that way DMT, or the DMT state, resembles the state of our Christian prophets.
Yeah, well, there were three, features of the DMT experience that ultimately, led me to a different, model for understanding what was taking place. The spiritual platform that I was standing on when I began the study was, that of, Zen Buddhism, and, the ultimate, goal of, Zen is enlightenment, or, Kensho, Satori experience, which is uniformly described as the experience of emptiness. There's no form, no body, no emotions, no perceptions, no thoughts, no images. So as opposed to that, the DMT experience was incredibly, full of content. There was, quite a bit of information and thinking. There were, lots of, visions and perceptions. There was the, sense of self was maintained, rather than, the union of the, self with the ground of being, the unification of one's, sense of self, or one's ego with the white light. That may have occurred in one of my volunteers out of nearly 5 dozen. So number one, the experience, wasn't like an enlightenment experience at all. It was, much more interactive and relational, rather than, what I call, mystical or unitive. One of the other, qualities of the DMT state was that the volunteers, came out of it convinced that what they had just perceived was more, real than everyday reality. More real than dreams. More real than their other, druggy experiences. More, real than real in a number of their descriptions. And so that flew in the, face of, both the Buddhist model, which would, look at those experiences as, mental, biological, neurological static on the way, towards the empty enlightened state. It also was inconsistent with my other two, models, which I had brought to bear on the work, which were the, psychoanalytic, which, looked at these, visions and these voices as the expression of unconscious, conflicts and impulses, or the biological, model, which just looked upon the visions and the voices as activation of certain brain centers as a result of the DMT, your brain on drugs, as it were. So those were the three, well, the interactive quality, the fulsome quality, and the more, real than real quality were all properties of the DMT state, which were different than the Buddhist Enlightenment state, and led me to start looking elsewhere for a spiritual model.
Hmm. So, and then you chose, for different reason, the prophetic state from the Bible.
Yeah. Well, towards the end of my first DMT book, DMT, the Spirit Molecule, I, kind of, postulated some, physical models for the DMT effect, and I kind of, settled on a speculative model, which proposed that DMT modifies chemically the receiving characteristics of the brain-mind complex and allows one's consciousness to peer into normally invisible realms or layers of reality. For example, dark matter is one possible location of what is perceived under the influence of DMT, parallel universes, those kinds of things which are ultimately going to be revealed through technology. But we might be getting a sneak preview by modifying the most complicated technology of which is available to us, which is the human brain. But even if those mechanisms turn out to be true, they still kind of leave unanswered a number of questions, and those questions are why would the brain be configured in that way? Why would the brain why would DMT be a naturally occurring substance in the human body? And also I think and well, so also just as important is the necessity of extracting information from that state. Not necessarily learning a new way to develop a spacecraft engine or pollution-free energy, but how to live better lives. How to become wiser, rather than smarter. So I then began to shift away from the scientific model, or the commonly the commonly accepted scientific model for understanding these states, into the more religious one, which which over the millennia has also been interested in states of consciousness which reveal things which are normally invisible. But they've got the advantage of millennia of extracting the meaning and the message of what's contained in those states, extracting ethical information, socially relevant information, rather than just describing within those states and proposing mechanistic models. So I then began looking at the different spiritual models as candidates, or candidate spiritual models. I already reviewed the shortcomings of the Buddhist model. Well, the shamanic model is interesting, because it does propose the reality of those states and what's apprehended in them.
Yeah.
But they're non-theistic, or they're polytheistic. They mostly are interested in the spirits of the plants, or the spirits of nature, rather than the one God of the West, which I think is an important notion. If any model is going to be getting traction in the Western mind. Well, also Latin American shamanism is kind of it's kind of challenged ethically and morally. There's a lot of spiritual warfare which occurs in the world of the Latin American shaman. Well, Stephen Beyer wrote a book called Singing to the Plants. It's all about ayahuasca shamanism.
Okay.
And he's got an interesting concept in there, which is there are which is that there are good shamans and there are bad shamans, but they're all bad shamans, because if you're going to cure someone of an illness, their model is that those illnesses came about through the activity of a bad shaman. So if you cure somebody, you're going to be incurring the wrath of the bad shaman. So it's just this constant battle.
Okay.
So even if you're a good shaman, you're still constantly at war with other shamans. So it's kind of crazy. And I don't think if you look deeply into that universe, it's going to be getting much traction in a educated Western kind of milieu. So then so then through a number of circumstances, I was led back to the Hebrew Bible or the Old Testament. One of those factors was I was kind of excommunicated by my Buddhist community because I was writing about the relationship between Zen practice and taking psychedelic drugs, which is one of Buddhism's dirty little secrets in the West anyway, is that the vast majority of the Western teachers of Buddhism got their start on psychedelics, and some even continue taking them surreptitiously. So the group I had been studying with was rather conservative, and even though all of their senior monks had gotten their first glance or glimpse of enlightenment on LSD, at a certain point they just weren't able to admit that in a public forum. So I did admit that in a public forum, or wanted to discuss it, which didn't go over very well. So we had to part ways. But that gave me the permission, as it were, to look back into my own tradition, which is Judaism, and I started reading the Hebrew Bible or the Old Testament, for a couple of reasons. One was to kind of go back to my roots, but the other was the kind of niggling curiosity that perhaps Judaism could would be able to provide a more salient model for the DMT effect.
I don't want to go too deeply into your new book because I hope the people will buy it and will discover that for themselves. But I was wondering, isn't that weird that we have this totally complex brain and this wonderful consciousness, and at the same time we have this drug which is naturally occurring in our bodies and numerous plants, which is altering the consciousness in significant ways. So I'm wondering what are your thoughts about this? What is the evolutionary purpose for this development? Why this design?
Well, when it comes to the cross-species presence of DMT, I like to think of the possibility of DMT as being a common language which is shared by all organisms which contain it, kind of a spiritual Esperanto, as it were, like a universal language, a Catholic language. So when people describe being able to relate to animals or certain plants or trees when they're on DMT, or even other psychedelics, which may ultimately be mediated by DMT as well. There could be some cross-species communication, which which is taking place, through the bridge of DMT. Why, things are, why, well, so why, things are, designed that way, is obviously a huge question, and I think it depends on your worldview, your spiritual view, your epistemological view, your kind of, how you know things. The way that I've kind of answered the question, for myself, using the lens of Jewish philosophy and religion, is that it was that DMT is in the human body, placed there by divinity, which which desires us to be able to relate and communicate with it. So I think in the case of the prophetic state, anyway, that DMT provides some perceptible form to usually imperceptible processes or information. Otherwise, we wouldn't be able to see it, or to hear it, or to feel it. And DMT provides a biological, mechanistic, clothing, or form that kind of enwraps usually imperceptible information. So I think it's there in order to provide access which we can apprehend of information or of processes which are normally invisible or imperceptible. Incomprehensible.
Certainly, system theory, radical constructivism, the theories of Maturana and Varela, a Buddhist, by the way, and Niklas Luhmann, and the whole theory about how consciousness and the nervous system is constructing its own reality in a way, so that we don't have a direct access to this physical world, but that our brains and our consciousness are creating their own subjective realities. And I wondered if the evolutionary purpose of DMT is to show, in a way, that these are actually constructed realities, that those things that we believe as solid and real are not as real when you experience dream states, when you experience lucid dreaming or near-death experience, or DMT for that matter, so that you realize, okay, this is one state of mind, these physical reality, but there are maybe different states with alternative states of the world. So I wondered if this is an evolutionary purpose of DMT, that we are more aware of the constructedness of reality.
Well, I think it's true that DMT's presence in our bodies and our brains calls into question a lot of the reality or the objective nature of what we interact with out there and in here. There's a couple of scientific nuggets which support an important role of DMT in consciousness and visual visual perception as well. In the 1970s, I think it was the 1970s. There was a research group in Japan which established that DMT is transported into the brain across the blood-brain barrier using energy, and only a very small number of compounds are treated that way by the brain. Ones which are required for normal brain function, such as blood sugar and certain amino acids that the brain is unable to make on its own for protein synthesis. So it seems as if DMT is required for normal brain function. And normal brain function means normal consciousness, and it may be that DMT serves as a kind of reality thermostat, like a narrow window is required for the maintenance of everyday perceptual and cognitive and emotional homeostasis. More recently, there was a group in Madison, Wisconsin, which demonstrated that the activity of the gene and the enzyme that it produces are quite active in the retina of the primate of the rhesus monkey.
Yeah.
So that also points towards an important role of DMT in consciousness, and in this case specifically visual consciousness. So it makes you wonder about the constructed nature of
general consciousness and of
visual consciousness. But then it starts to become solipsistic or recursive or tautological or some philosophical term, because like I've speculated about DMT being kind of naturally occurring matrix, like an endomatrix, as opposed to the externally imposed matrix of the movie trilogy.
Okay.
It's a internally generated matrix which constructs all of this. And there's the blue pill and the red pill, right? You take the red pill and you understand what's going on. And the blue pill keeps you in the DMT mediated matrix. But still that kind of begs the question, like if you take the red pill and you find out what's really going on, what's to prevent there being a red pill in the universe which the red pill reveals to you. So it can become kind of an endless spiral. Like when I first began wondering about maybe this is all DMT hallucinations that we're living in 24/7. And if that were the case, would we live our lives any differently? Would the golden rule cease to exist? Would karma, cause and effect, cease to exist? Would there no longer be the need or the fact of envisioning or coming up with the notion of one God? Would the ethical, basis of our world change? The theological basis of our world change? And I kind of answered that question to myself by saying, no, things would continue, moving along in the same, manner. We would still have to be nice to people.
Of course.
We would still, need to pray to, something higher. So, even if, this, were completely a constructed universe, I'm just not sure we would live our lives any differently. So it's interesting to speculate about, but we have to be careful that, that we don't, let those ideas, cause us to, detour from the most important questions.
No. It wasn't meant that way. That it wasn't meant in a solipsistic way that we are constructing the reality. But I was more thinking in the lines of developmental theory, so that we get perspectives on how we think, on how we use narratives and perspectives and all the things. One other thing I wanted to ask was, there was like this controversial figure, Timothy Leary, who was first a Harvard psychologist, and then he started to work with LSD, and later he developed a model of the circuits of the human brain, this 8-circuit model, which resembles pretty good those development models we use today. So, and Leary proposed that humanity uses specific substances to turn specific stages on. For example, culture uses marijuana to turn the postmodern pluralistic hedonistic stage of development. and that LSD, for example, turns on the what is it called in his words, the meta-programming, the construct-aware stage of the human mind. So, and I wonder if you in any way correlate DMT with stages of the human mind. So not only states, but also stages, levels of development.
Yeah, I think you can, simplistically, maybe from the point of view of neurotransmitters, look upon, the dopamine way of looking at the world and interacting with it, and the, serotonin way of dealing with the world and interacting with it, perceiving it. Dopamine is the, neurotransmitter which, mediates the effects of speed, of stimulants, reward, surges of energy, focus, concentration, one-pointedness of attention, getting things done as quickly and as and as hard as you can. And in a way, caffeine, even though it doesn't stimulate dopamine per se, it still it still activates a number of similar circuits as dopamine does. And in opposition or in balance or in contrast to that is the serotonin model. Serotonin is the neurotransmitter which is most involved in the psychedelic state.
Okay.
Psychedelic consciousness. So it could be that we're looking at a tension or a dialectic between dopamine and serotonin. What's going to prevail, or can they establish some kind of equilibrium with each other, that you're not completely tripped out all the time, but you're not completely buzzed all the time either. Some kind of modulation or mediation between the two. There's alcohol as well, or benzodiazepines, which are the more sedating kind of compounds which work on GABA, GABA, gamma aminobutyric acid. Well, there used to be a great chemist out there named Alexander Shulgin.
Oh yeah.
And he he liked to divide on the drugs into stars and ups and downs. Like an up arrow,
of course,
and a down arrow and a star. So the uppers, were the stimulants. The down arrows, were the sedatives and alcohol, and the stars were the psychedelics. So it could be that each of them has got a place within the neurotransmitter milieu of the brain as well. Not necessarily external. So not necessarily external chemicals, that you take in from the outside.
So, but you wouldn't say that you can use LSD or DMT for that matter to turn on higher stages of development. You wouldn't go that far.
Well, there are different stages of development. I think it's important to not, gild the lily when it comes to the psychedelics. Psychedelics, have been used for all kinds of, nefarious, purposes over, the millennia. Historically, and I've seen plenty of, cases where the psychedelic psychedelic drug effects are abused, either by the individual taking them, or they're abused in or they're abused in the context of interpersonal relationships. I've seen people use psychedelics to inflict all kinds of emotional, spiritual, psychological, verbal abuse on other people. So I, think of the psychedelics as psychedelics. They're mind manifesting. So if you're a sadistic individual and you take psychedelics, the chances are you'll be a psychedelicized sadist. I don't think automatically you're going to become a kinder, more gentle person.
Okay.
That could happen, but if you're a sadist, you can also get insights which might moderate your darker impulses through alcohol or through sedatives or through marijuana or through even stimulants. I think there are tendencies for certain drugs to have certain effects, but I don't think you can describe them in a blanket way as good or bad or neutral. I like to think of these drugs as tools, like a hammer. I mean, you can build a house with a hammer. You can knock down a house with a hammer. I think it's important to keep in mind the concept of the set and the setting and the intent behind the use of the drugs. That's why I'm uncomfortable with using the term of entheogen, because it assumes the belief in a spiritual level of reality and a particular state of consciousness, which either people don't believe in or the state never comes to pass. I think the psychedelic as manifesting mind is much more generic and all-inclusive, and it takes into account both the good responses to psychedelics, the expanding ones, the higher level ones, the mind expanding, or their consciousness expanding properties. But I think it also takes into account the mind constricting or the making smaller of the mind, which also can occur on psychedelics.
I understand. So supposedly the consummation of DMT would be legal. For whom would be that drug, and what is the use of that finally? What is who should use the drug, who could use the drug, and what would be the benefit?
I still believe that there ought to be restrictions on DMT and other psychedelics. I don't think it's especially prudent to make them available to anyone. Marijuana, at least how it's normally used, it can be dispensed medically or recreationally with certain guidelines. But I think the psychedelics are just they're just too destabilizing and too strong for anybody to use any time in any set of circumstances. So people are always going to use drugs underground, but for public discourse, the larger public arena, the polity, as it were, I think that there ought to remain regulations around the use, the administration, the taking of psychedelics. So that being said, I think there ought to be certain places where certain people could take certain drugs under the supervision of certain sitters, supervisors. Well, the people ought to be screened carefully, supervised carefully, during the experience, prepared, work on their intent, any psychopathology that might be causing trouble during this state, and they ought to be followed up quite carefully as well. And so that being said, there are a number of models or a number of intentions which could be fruitfully mind for the potentially beneficial effects of the psychedelics. Well, for therapy, and therapy could extend to a number of conditions which are difficult to treat. Like the addictions, and that was one of the mainstays of the first wave of psychedelic drug research in humans. The use of LSD for alcoholism and for heroin abuse, and those are being replicated nowadays, mostly using psilocybin, for alcoholism, for tobacco use, and for opiates, for depression. Ketamine is useful for depression. People used LSD for depression back in the day, and it's being ayahuasca is being studied for depression, as is psilocybin. Things like OCD, things like autism, kind of a hybrid between a spiritual use of these drugs and a psychotherapeutic one is end of life treatment. People who have a terminal diagnosis or facing all kinds of issues, and these drugs were used previously to treat end of life anxiety and depression, and those studies are occurring again, reappearing, using present methodologies, and are also quite promising. The spiritual use of these drugs like DMT are being studied, especially psilocybin, but ayahuasca as well. There are obviously important questions regarding the relationship between brain function and consciousness, which were begun kind of crudely during the first wave of studies, but can be can be redone in a much more sophisticated way now with the development of brain imaging technologies out there. Creativity as well. There were some preliminary studies using psychedelics in normals in order to enhance creativity. Those were some promising results which were never looked at or never followed up. And I think those kinds of studies are important. Also, there is a there's an argument to be made for people being able to use these drugs purely for enjoyment, for pleasure, for enhancement of aesthetics. But still, it can't be completely unbridled use. I think there ought to be some safeguards in place, which is the screening, the preparation, supervision, and follow-up. So I think there's a huge gamut of human experience which could possibly be enhanced, improved, augmented through the use of these substances. So I think it's very interesting, very exciting that we're able to use these substances again in a more public manner, to publish, to have conferences and meetings, to be able to discuss their pros and their cons in a more open-ended forum than purely underground or in an illegal context.
Yeah, I guess it was Aldous Huxley who wrote the psychedelics. I don't know if he referred only to ayahuasca and LSD or also to DMT, that a lead group of artists and scientists should have the chance to work with them, to tap, as you say, into the matrix and have some new insights in our mind and how the world works in a way. I like that sentiment. I like that thought.
Yeah. Yeah, well, there were two, models of, giving psychedelics or taking, psychedelics, that were in, competition, with each other. One was the Aldous Huxley model, which was, that, the rich get richer, as it were. The more elite, sophisticated, uneducated, artistic, spiritually inclined, people, should be the ones that have access to these, substances and the experiences that the occasion, because they would be the most, likely to, make, the most of what they're shown. So that was, in competition, to Tim Leary's more egalitarian approach was, for everybody to, to tune in and, turn on and,
drop out.
And to drop out. And that was Ken Kesey's model as well. Kind of the West Coast equivalent of the egalitarian approach. And I think that there are arguments. Well, I believe that there are arguments to be made in support of and against both of those ideas. For example, if they're completely freely available, then unstable people with a latent psychosis or what have you, that abuse other drugs, they might get into serious psychological trouble as a result of taking psychedelics. But on the other hand, there's a lot of people who might be able to take great advantage of the psychedelic experience, who would be exposed to these drugs who otherwise would not be able to if one were limited by Huxley's view, that only a small number of the cream of the cream ought to be able, to take these substances. On the other hand, if the elite were the only people that were able, to be able, that were going to be able, to have access, to these drugs. It might be true that they would be able to make the most of their experiences, but they wouldn't have the feedback that was necessary to maintain humanistic or compassionate point of view. They would get so far removed from the common man as to cause potentially more harm than good.
One last question, more out of personal curiosity. When you did your studies in Santa Fe in New Mexico, was it near the Santa Fe Institute of Complexity? No, the Santa Fe Institute where they're making this research about complexity, and Stuart Kaufman comes to mind, and all these people, Per Buck. Is the same complex? Was it near you or?
So my studies took place at the University of New Mexico School of Medicine, which is in Albuquerque. It's about an hour, from Santa Fe. Well, I, vaguely remember that I contacted, the Santa Fe Institute, and I asked them if they were interested in my work, if they wanted, to collaborate. But, I may be, misremembering, that I reached out to them or not, but I, never spoke there, and they, never contacted me. So, my studies occurred at the university in Albuquerque.
Because I think we all have to deal with complexity in many ways, and in that state of DMT, you're in a way confronted with a unbearable complexity, and you have to make sense of it.
Well, New Mexico is a very, complex, place. It's sparsely populated. There's a lot of, creativity. There's an interesting, mix of Hispanic and Anglo and, Native American, cultures, which are always fertilizing each other. It's a land of great, natural beauty. There's a lot of spiritual, centers, spiritual teachers. There's a couple of national, laboratories here. It was, the home of the atomic bomb. It's, the poorest state in the Union. So it's an extremely, complex place. I came to New Mexico to, work at the university because ultimately I was interested in studying, psychedelics. And I figured that it was a, libertarian state, libertarian university, as long as I didn't, hurt anybody, and kept my name out of the newspapers, that I would be able to, get this study off the ground, as opposed to a place with a lot more scrutiny, media, accessibility, and concern for political correctness. Figured if I did good science and kept my nose clean, as it were, that this would be a lot more likely place to get this research off the ground than elsewhere.
Oh, okay.
And that turned out to be the case.
So, Rick, thank you very much that you took the time to talk a little bit about your work and DMT and all that stuff. Your new book is called DMT and the Soul of Prohecy. It was published, I guess,
Right.
autumn last year, 2015.
It was. It actually came out in 2014. So it's
2014.
been out about
Okay.
2 years now.
Okay.
Yeah. And I'm still looking for a German publisher. My first DMT book was published by A.T. Verlag. My first DMT book was published by A.T. Verlag in a German edition. So if you know of any German publishers, for example yourself, who might want to take on a German version, let me know.